First of all, welcome. Thanks for joining us for this month's free live webinar with Attuned. We have a fantastic guest for us today who's going to talk about how leaders can improve their written communication. Before that, just let me introduce myself. I'm Paul Kay, the head of content at Attuned. So if you're not familiar with Attuned, Attuned is a psychology-backed, AI-driven platform that shows companies what really matters to their employees by measuring and visualizing intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation, if you're not familiar, is the unique values and preferences that drive each person from within. By working with intrinsic motivation, busy managers get to know their teams quicker, they can identify blind spots at a glance and communicate more effectively. And the result, increased engagement, productivity and innovation, more psychological safety, better communication, which is what we're here to talk about today, and ultimately happier organizations. We're very lucky to have with us today for today's webinar, Ben Hughes. Ben is an experienced speaker and trainer on remote and hybrid leadership. He's also the former director of content at Blinkist and co-author of the book, The Loop Approach: How to Transform Your Organization from the Inside Out. Ben, I'll hand it over to you. So let's just start with the question: how can leaders improve their written communication? Tell us a bit about yourself, and then let's crack on.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks Attuned for hosting this webinar. And yes, as Paul said, my name is indeed Ben Hughes. It's a pleasure to be here. I can't see you because I'm sharing my screen. So if you're gesturing wildly to the camera, I'm missing all of that. But anyway, I want to start with a little bit about my background, so you can decide, whether or not you want to believe anything I have to say on this topic. And my educational background comes from the fields of industrial management and psychology. And when I started my professional career almost 15 years ago, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And if you're an industrial management graduate and you don't know what you want to do, there's really only one thing you can do. So I started working as a management consultant. And I was a really junior consultant at the time, but my impression of the leaders in consulting was that their job was actually pretty easy, because there are so many people who really want to work at these companies. Everyone's really motivated, all these industrial management graduates who don't know what to do. And they all want to show that, they're the smartest people in the room, and they're just kind of full of drive. So as a lead, all you really need are good project management skills. You kind of direct them in the right direction. And if someone on your team doesn't make it, doesn't perform, there are pretty clear mechanisms for them to be directed out of the door. And don't worry, because there's then 10 other equally motivated candidates just waiting to take their spot. And what it means is that as a lead, you don't really have to worry about how people are feeling on your team. And that's why it was such a shock to me when later I found out that actually there's way more to leadership than that. And a leader can actually do a lot more to support great performance and great team spirit and professional growth for everyone in the team. And I learned this in 2012 when, after a few years as a consultant, I said, okay, this is probably not for me. And I joined a Berlin-based startup called Blinkist, which Paul mentioned earlier. The idea behind Blinkist is, in case you're not familiar, that there are all these great nonfiction books out there, great podcasts out there. No one has the time to listen to or read all the ones we want. So Blinkist takes the key messages and makes these 15-minute packages so that you can, consume them even when you don't have time and get learnings that way. And since then, Blinkist has grown immensely. So I joined as the first full-time employee. Now it has almost 200 employees, tens of millions of users. And the content team that I led grew to be about 20 people strong. And the whole time I led it in a hybrid setting, meaning I was here in Finland, and most of the rest of the team was in Berlin, where I would fly over maybe once a month or so. And this experience was a real eye-opener for me in terms of what matters in leadership and what especially matters in hybrid and remote leadership. And I'm really proud of what we did there with that team, because we were ambitious and we hit our targets year after year. But more than that, we were really close-knit, and we had this tremendous sense of trust and psychological safety in the team. So whenever you looked at our engagement surveys, they were off the charts compared to any other team or industry benchmarks. And people really praised the fact that, hey, here you can speak your mind, you can try things, and you can fail, and you can bring your whole self to work, and that is okay. And as you probably know, these are some of the core elements in driving sustained high performance in a team, and also just, making it a great place to work. And I'd say as an indicator of how we succeeded here, in the 10-year period that I was there, our team grew to be 20 people strong, and only one person ever left. And when we told this to other companies, they literally didn't believe us. They said, like, no, that's statistically impossible, that kind of staff retention rate. But it was true. And any lead, or actually any team, will know how disruptive it can be when someone leaves your team, and then you need to start a recruiting process. And when you find someone, you need to onboard them, and it's months before you're back up to full speed. So I really see this high retention rate as also kind of one of the key drivers of our performance. And I want to be totally clear that we did it together as a team. What we created there, we did it together. But I do think that also some of my choices, initiatives, but above all, habits also helped foster this kind of atmosphere. And after 10 years, I left the company and started reflecting on, okay, why did that happen? What did we do that worked? And I also studied what others have written about remote and hybrid leadership. And since then, I've been trying to share these learnings through various avenues. So basically since early last year. And I give keynotes on this topic at corporate events and conferences and the like. And I also built this training course for leaders around the topic of hybrid and remote leadership. And I'll say a bit more about that in just a moment. And last but not least, as Paul mentioned, I had the honor of co-authoring a book called The Loop Approach. We did it together with one of the Blinkist co-founders called Sebastian Klein. And it's basically about the future of organizations and the future of teams. And it's basically like a manual or collection of different new work and self-organization approaches that we believe can make teams and therefore organizations more effective and adaptive, whatever the future looks like. But that's enough about me. Let's get to the topic. So as Paul, you asked, why is written communication such a critical tool for remote and hybrid leaders? And for me, it really comes down to the question of where and when can a leader have the greatest impact on their team? And in my experience, it's really not the kind of grand moments of leadership when you get to unveil an inspiring vision or run this big strategy workshop and everyone applauds and rah, 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 and all that. No, it's the daily interactions that we have with our teams. So the hundreds of quick chats and messages and coffees and questions over lunch, it's these mundane interactions that far outweigh the more glorious moments of leadership, because these situations is where you as the lead can, through consistency, show the team that, hey, you know me, you can trust me, it's safe for you to be yourself and to be ambitious and take risks with me. Now, of course, interactions like this happen hundreds of times a day. So how are we supposed to change our behavior across hundreds of interactions a day? I think the only hope we have is that we learn some new habits, because with habits, we can be tired, we can be distracted, we can be on autopilot, and we can still get those situations right, or at least close to right most of the time. And so I've developed these things I call hybrid habits, meaning new habits and tools that I believe are needed for the most important areas that leaders need to focus on when they lead a team in a hybrid or remote setting. And today I want to especially focus on written communication. Why is that? Well, if you think about the interactions that you have with your team, in the office, you'll have a whole smorgasbord of them. There'll be the meetings, the quick chats in the hallways, around the water cooler, at lunch, someone comes by your desk, so forth. But when you're not in the office together, all of the in-office stuff gets cut out. And what you're left with are remote meetings or calls and all manner of written communication, whether it's an email or an instant message or a comment in a document. So like it or not, when you're remote, when you're not there in person, it's these two categories, meetings and written messages, that form the vast majority of media through which you as a leader can influence your team. So that's why I'm here to talk about written communication, because it's one of these two very important interaction media. And, typically you will send some kind of written message to someone in your team about 50 to 100 times a day. So clearly, if you can make any improvement here, the effect is going to be amplified through sheer volume alone. And the great danger we have in written communication is that we tend to misunderstand intentions. In face-to-face communication, we have all this nonverbal information like gestures and facial expressions and tone of voice that help convey the right emotion and the right intention to the other person. But of course, in writing, these are all stripped away. And this can easily lead to misunderstandings and unwanted, unfruitful conflict. And there's a psychologist called Daniel Goleman. He wrote a lot about emotional intelligence, and he studied this phenomenon. And he found that for every email you write, it actually tends to get interpreted as one notch more hostile than you intended. So if you sent a message that you meant as a nice one, it's going to be interpreted as neutral. And if you send a neutral one, it's going to seem hostile. And of course, the same dynamic applies when you receive the other person's reply. So it's easy to see how things can escalate with no ill intention on anyone's behalf. So what can you do? Well, you need to learn the mantra of think before you send, and just become much more mindful about how you write and how the recipient is likely to interpret it, considering that they can't see or hear you. And I think this means adopting a few simple habits in your writing. And these are hardly rocket science. I'm sure you probably do all of these or some of these to some extent, but I just want to say that I think you really reap the most benefits when you try to be very consistent here. And I'm going to start by listing some smaller, easy, simple habits before moving on to some maybe slightly more challenging ones. And you should know that I'm going to cover quite a few, but please know that at this stage, you don't need to worry about how you're going to implement them, because we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So the first habit is just that you can almost never go wrong in your written comms if you just try to make your messages a little bit kinder, a little bit more upbeat, to make your good intentions and good energy super clear in the message. Because as you'll remember, Daniel Goleman found that even if you just want a neutral message, you need to kick it up a notch, because the written medium will bring it down a notch. Then second habit is that if you're asking a team member for something, be sure to give some context for your request. Like, why are you asking for this? What does this enable you to do? It's so easy to forget this, especially if you're in a hurry, but it really helps give the other person the feeling that, hey, they're working on this together with you. They're not just some cog in a machine kind of dispensing favors. And it also helps them actually help you, because with the context, they will be able to give you the information you need instead of the information you think you need. And finally, there's actually evidence to suggest that if you give a reason, any reason, it increases the chances that they will say yes. So this works in everyone's favor. Then a third small habit is to be considerate also about responding to responses. And a personal example here, for a long time, I had this terrible habit with my team where, especially if I was in a hurry with something and I needed some information from them, I would ask them for it, then they'd respond, and then I was just so happy I got the information. Now I can continue work on my project. I didn't in any way acknowledge that they had just given me what I had asked for. And then maybe days or weeks later, I'd need something again, and I'd realize, whoa, I never responded to that message. And then I'd say something like, hey, thanks for last time. Here's the next request. And I've been on the other side of that kind of relationship also, and it just feels really disrespectful and just needlessly underscores the power dynamic at play there. So that's why I try to make it a habit to always respond with something like thank you or thumbs up, or just something to acknowledge that I've seen this and I appreciate it. Then the fourth small habit I highly recommend is avoiding irony and sarcasm in your written comms, because there's a really high risk that it'll be misunderstood without all the nonverbal information you'd have in a face-to-face interaction. And so team members can easily get confused, they can get anxious about what you meant. And, as a lead, you should know that people probably take what you write more seriously than you realize. So you need to be especially careful. And as a cautionary tale, I've seen a case where a team member has made like a minor error in a document or something. And then the lead tries to be funny and they make a tongue-in-cheek comment on Slack like, oh, I'm going to have to talk about this in your next performance review, ha, ha, ha. And it's pretty cringy and it can prompt anxiety in the person. And again, it needlessly underscores the power dynamic, which I really don't recommend you do unless you absolutely have to. And that's because in my experience, professionals these days, they're very well educated. They know their worth. They really don't appreciate kind of flaunting that power dynamic needlessly. So I'd say just as a rule, stay sincere in your written messages. And regarding all of these habits, they are extra important for you as a lead because your communication actually sets the tone for the whole team. So if you start to change your communication to be more considerate and upbeat and respectful, you'll start to see ripple effects across the entire team's communication. Now, as I said, those were pretty basic habits. So now I want to move on to something a bit more challenging. So what about situations where you yourself receive a message that triggers a strong emotional response in you, like maybe anxiety or worry or anger? So imagine, for example, you get a message where you feel like you're being unfairly criticized, or someone on your team has created a big mess and now you need to clean it up and it's like Friday at 5 p.m. Or you just get a very angry message. I mean, that in itself can trigger a strong emotion in you too. Well, a normal human, totally human knee-jerk reaction is that you want to do something to make that feeling go away. You don't want to feel it anymore. And typically that something is that you want to shoot off a quick response and really give this other person a piece of your mind. Don't do that, because whatever you would write would likely be an overreaction because you're feeling these strong emotions. And what's more, unlike in a face-to-face interaction, the other person won't see from your face that they hit a nerve. So your hostile response will come out of the blue for them. And the best remedy I found for dealing with these kinds of situations is that you make a habit of using a technique called the kindest response possible. It comes from a wonderful book called Search Inside Yourself. It was written by one of the very early Google engineers who since has become a bit of a mindfulness guru, especially focusing on mindfulness at work. And the way it works is that when you feel a message triggering that strong emotion in you, you start by taking a breath, and then you draft the nicest, kindest answer imaginable, even if you're actually furious inside. And this is just an exercise. You don't need to send it. You can still write that fuming message later if you want. But in my experience, every single time I've read through the message that I've drafted, it's really good. And not only has it constructively moved the conversation forward, but it's also helped me calm down. And, if the other person's communication maybe wasn't that considerate in their first message, the contrast you create with your response, it typically also sparks a bit of reflection in them and just kind of calms the whole conversation down. And it's really never too late to employ this. Even if the conversation has already become heated, you can still use it and calm it down that way. And in fact, I'd say that if you combine this habit with enough self-awareness and courage to also apologize when you've made a mistake, maybe said something too harshly, I think you'll find that when you resolve conflicts in a constructive way, they can actually strengthen the bond you have with the other person instead of weakening it. But thinking of this technique, the kindest response possible, what do you think is the most important step here in this whole technique? And please put it in the chat if you have an idea. Excellent responses here. And Carrie, you are right on the money, because the whole thing hinges on your ability to take that breath, not go to that knee-jerk reaction, but instead keep a cool head and make better choices. And for this, there's a foundational habit that I highly, highly recommend adopting, and it is a meditation habit. Because one of the many benefits of meditation is that you better understand what's happening in your mind, and you get better impulse control. So you can choose differently instead of just blindly reacting. And in my experience, if you practice for just 10 minutes a day, it can already be pretty powerful and really starts to reflect in your leadership, among other things. So meditation, I think, is like a muscle that you can use in various situations, but also as a hybrid and remote leader. So then the next and final habit I want to introduce for improving written communication that we're going to discuss is something that I know might be a bit controversial. I kind of talked about it in my blog post already. Some of you may have read it. To lead into that, let me ask, what's your favorite emoji? Please put it in the chat. Very nice emojis, all of them. Excellent. So I think, like I said in the blog post for Attuned before, every hybrid and remote leader should employ emojis as a tool. And I am a convert here. So just maybe five years ago, I would have said emojis in the workplace. What is this, Mardi Gras? Like, no, that's a kid's fad or something. It doesn't belong here. But since then, I've come to the conclusion that actually they're probably the greatest development to how we express ourselves in writing since the alphabet was formalized, at least in the Western context. And the reason is that you'll remember I said before that in writing, we lose gestures, we lose tone of voice, we lose this nonverbal information that influences how our emotional tone is perceived. This is exactly what emojis are there for, to make up for this loss, to bridge this gap. And this was recently reaffirmed for me by the study. It's quoted in The Guardian. It found that emoji faces in text trigger the same neural responses as if you were face-to-face. And that's a powerful, powerful communication enhancing tool in this era where we often are not face-to-face. Because with just a few symbols, you can convey the emotional context that you want and avoid those misunderstandings, avoid that conflict. And I'm going to show you a quick example around this. So first, if you imagine that you would receive these messages from your lead. I will give you a moment to read. So you may notice that these messages, they're a little bit matter of fact. They're a little bit blunt, like maybe your lead is displeased or irritated somehow. But then when you add, in my opinion, one of the most useful emojis of all, the sweat smile, the tone instantly transforms. It's much more playful. There's no more coldness. It's not like accusatory or anything. And these messages are just way more likely to elicit a good response. And they also signal to the other person that, hey, you care about this relationship. So that's why I believe that every 21st century hybrid or remote leaders should employ emojis in their communication. And at the very least, it's worth giving them a try. Now, I can hardly mention emojis without mentioning GIFs and memes, which I gotta say, I don't use much personally. Maybe I'm a late adopter here, but I do see a definite use case for leaders. And it's just that sometimes you can really nail a sentiment or message perfectly if you use the right GIF, and it introduces an element of kind of fun into the communication. And I think having fun at work and having a lead who appreciates fun, it's underrated in how much it does for team engagement and work enjoyment. So regarding GIFs, imagine a team member messages you to tell you that a big project they've been working on for months, it was a success. Would it be more fitting of this great moment to answer with this? It's fine. Or this GIF. So again, it can just be a bit more playful with the GIF, and sometimes just hit the nail on the head in terms of what feeling you want to convey. So to recap what we've talked about so far, you can only influence your team when you interact with them. And when you're not all in the office together, which is pretty common, one of your most frequent areas of interaction will be written messages. So that's where you need to focus your efforts on improving. And there are quite a few habits to pick up around these that I talked about. So I said, let's keep messages positive to make up for the written medium. Let's give context to the requests we make to team members. Use emojis, GIFs, avoid irony, avoid referencing the power dynamic unnecessarily. Be mindful about responding to responses also. And use the kindest response possible technique when you yourself are in the throes of strong emotions. And then there's this foundational habit of meditation, which I highly recommend because it kind of helps with everything. So those are all the different habits that can be applied, and most of them are agnostic regarding the channel you use. So they'll work in email, comments in documents, Slack, MS Teams, faxes, telegrams, you name it. And if you use these habits consistently in the hundreds of messages you send every week, you start to build this idea in your team that, hey, it's okay to approach you with anything, also bad news, also criticism. And the person will always get a thoughtful, respectful response that really shows that you appreciate them and the relationship. And not only is this important for things like psychological safety, but to quote Daniel Abrahams, LinkedIn influencer, no employee ever left a job because they felt overappreciated. So these habits just create this daily evidence that, hey, you respect the person and you appreciate them, and that can be really transformative. Of course, it only works if it works. So somehow these habits need to make it into your workday consistently, which leads us to the question of how are you going to implement these? And with any habit, what's really important is to find a good cue, which basically means the thing that you see or hear that sets the habit into motion, the trigger. Or it could also be a thought or a feeling, just some kind of cue that you automatically associate with this habit that you perform. And all of these written habits have the benefit that there's a pretty good cue for them, namely whether it's a comment or a chat message or an email, you will write it on your keyboard. By the way, sorry if there's a lot of child-related noise bleeding onto the call, unavoidable, unfortunately, but I'll carry on. So yeah, you always write your messages on your keyboard, mostly if it's not on your phone, but you're going to need to do a little bit of work in the beginning to connect this cue, the keyboard, to the habits that you're trying to pick up. And typically most people will write messages frequently throughout the day. The trouble is it's going to be really hard for you to keep these habits top of mind throughout that long period of time and throughout those interactions. So what I recommend you start with is that you batch your message writing. So that means you define a time in each day when you write your messages and responses all in a row. This way you can kind of get in the zone with these habits and you keep them in mind as you write message after message, and slowly your brain starts to form the connection between the cue, your keyboard, and the routines or habits in this case. And I would also argue that this approach, it can also be better for your productivity because you're not constantly having to switch context. So you have your message writing time and the rest of the time is for meetings and deep work. Now, depending on your situation, your environment, it may be that one batch isn't enough. Maybe you need two, maybe you need multiple batches in a day because people expect very quick turnarounds in messages. But in general, what I have found that in most cases, a one-time slot is sufficient as long as you make it clear to people that, hey, this is the time frame when you can expect a response from me in, and you provide some way of getting in touch with you in urgent matters, like maybe calling you. And that brings us to the homework for this webinar. I bet you weren't expecting that when you signed up. It comprises 2 steps. So basically, 1, block time for writing messages in your calendar each day for the next week. And 2, before sending each message, review if any habit could be applied that we've discussed. And if you want to make it easier for yourself and are serious about implementing this, just reach out to me and I can share a cheat sheet that has all these habits listed in it, so you can keep it open while you write and kind of quickly glance through it before you send each message. It's a bit like having a toolbox open and occasionally looking in to see, like, okay, I have a challenge, which tools could I apply here? And this probably sounds arduous, but I promise that very quickly you won't need, or relatively quickly, you won't need to look at the sheet anymore at all. And pretty soon the keyboard will become such a strong cue for these habits that they'll basically be like second nature when you write. Also, on a mobile phone. And then if you want, you can stop answering in batches, but you might also find that it's, worth it just for productivity reasons alone. And regarding all the habits we talked about, if you miss a day, don't worry about it. That happens to everyone. But try not to miss 2 days in a row, because then you're kind of starting to form a new habit of not using this. And then, just as bonus homework, highly recommend the meditation habit, which I think is a foundational tool that can help you pause before reacting. And it's never been easier to start meditating. There are tons of guided meditations on YouTube. There are various apps, there are books. That said, I do have a recommendation for how to make fast progress as a meditator. It is an app called Waking Up. The name doesn't refer to literally waking up from sleep, but about waking up from the dream of being lost in thought and in this reactive state of mind. And they have this 30-day course, which really impressed me. So before I took it, I had already been meditating for years, but I still felt like, wow, this starts from a beginner level, and it took me to a point where I really felt like, wow, I learned a lot and advanced a lot. So that is absolutely not the way you need to go, but if you are interested, just reach out to me and I can share a link that will give you 30 days of free access. So you can just about do the course if you're very diligent. No credit card details required. This isn't one of those deals where I get like referral credits or anything. No, this is just the best avenue into becoming a regular meditator that I've found so far. And of course, if you strongly feel that, no, meditation isn't for me, I'm tired of hearing about it from everyone, that's fine. You need to make decisions that work for you. I just want to mention that I believe this can be very, very transformative. So that was it for written communication. Another area that I think is crucial is, of course, remote meetings, because as you'll remember, that was the second major category of interactions that you have with your team. So you can't, as a lead, afford for them to be chaotic or draining. You need to ensure that when you have remote or hybrid meetings, people walk out of them with more energy than they came in with, and they have clear next actions. They know what to focus on. They know what to do next. Then a third area of hybrid habits is aligning on shared rules and protocols for communicating in the team. And this is called a communication charter. So it's basically a rule book which explains how to communicate in your team. So, for example, what channel do we use for what purpose? When are people expected to be responsive to messages? What meetings should they attend? If we're across multiple time zones, maybe are there hours when we should all be online together for synchronous work? So these kinds of principles are defined there. And it just clears up a lot of misunderstandings and makes communication a lot smoother. Then a fourth area of hybrid habits is building trust. And that is, of course, notoriously difficult for remote and hybrid teams. And that's due to this sociological concept called the proximity principle. And basically, it just says that we humans tend to naturally bond more with people we're in close physical proximity to. If someone isn't there, we tend to bond less with them and trust them less. And what that means is that when a team isn't in close physical proximity, you need to take some steps to kind of boost that trust to the levels where it should be, because you've got this proximity principle fighting against you. And finally, the last area is providing clarity to team members around what's expected of them so that everyone can really take ownership of the work and also coordinate work together with others, no matter where they are. So these 5 areas make up kind of the key components of hybrid habits. And today we talked about written communication. And now we are almost at the end of the slide deck. What on earth could be on the last slides? Oh, it's an upsell message. So just as a reminder, I give keynotes on this topic at corporate events, maybe as inspiration before a workshop, also conferences. And I built a course around this topic, hybrid and remote leadership, where I include individual exercises, group work, homework, projects to really try to bring the learnings into the students' daily work. And I know personally how busy leads are, which is why my goal is that these should be as easy as possible to implement, and that they should actually save time for the lead in the mid to long run. And I see this as a really burning topic to help keep hybrid and remote teams engaged and effective. So if this sounds like something that your organization maybe anticipates training needs in, or you have an event coming up where you think, oh, this could be a good topic for a keynote, let's definitely talk. And that's it from me. You'll find my email address there at the bottom of this slide, by the way, in case you want the cheat sheet or discuss anything else. So thanks again, Paul and Attuned, for inviting me. And yeah, everyone, don't hesitate to reach out over email, also on LinkedIn. Also, if you just want to chat further, that's fine. So yeah,
great.
Maybe
Thanks,
then,
Bennett. That's super fascinating. Oh, sorry, I forgot you had the last slide, the question mark.
No, okay.
Well, the question mark, this beautiful question mark, AI generated question mark, is indicating is that we've now reached the Q&A portion. I see a couple of questions coming through. If anyone has any more, please either put them in the Q&A function or in the chat. I think that was super interesting, Ben. I got to say, especially the kindest response possible. I wish someone had explained that to me quite some time ago. I think it would have saved me a lot of conversations that didn't go as well as they could have. So yeah, some really great tips in there. One of the first questions we've got here is about batching messages. So how do you respond in a timely manner if you're batching? I guess a lot of us are in positions where there's kind of time critical responses needed, or perhaps an expectation that you do respond quicker than at the end of the day. How can you account for and incorporate new emails or messages that come in throughout the day? How can you explain to do that?
That's a great question. So I think you could, for example, set up 2 batches, one at noon, one before you, finish work, kind of whatever works for, your environment. If it's very dynamic, that may be required. Maybe you do 30 minutes at the top of each 2-hour period, for example. I think more fundamentally, this communication charter could help with clarifying the expectations around that. And basically, what that entails is that you would co-create with your team kind of the rules and guidelines and protocols around communication, answering, for example, how quickly are we expected to be responsive? And it is totally possible that in some environments, there are really lots and lots of messages that need an answer now, not in a couple of hours. But sometimes that's also not the case, and it's just kind of it's a thing you do, or a thing you feel is expected of you, and everyone kind of expects it from each other because there's this feeling that this is what should be done, and actually it's not really necessary. And in a communication charter, then you can discuss if that is actually necessary. Are these so critical? If the message comes at the end of the day instead of in 30 minutes, is that going to cause, irreparable harm to the team or organization? Maybe. If so, then I still wouldn't recommend using then messages for that, because that basically means everyone needs to keep Slack or MS Teams open all the time, which is very disruptive for deep work. And what I then say is that, okay, let's define, email is for messages where you expect a response in by the end of the next day. Instant messages are for situations where you expect a response by end of day. And if it's same day urgent, pick up the phone, call them. So those kind of rules could help kind of categorize the messages and make sure that the fires do get put out if they appear, but without, disrupting people's days.
Great. We've got another question related to your answer there. Do you have any examples of communication charters that you could share, either now, or we could send it out with the post webinar info as well?
Yes, I have a fictional one I use in my course. Maybe if you reach out for the cheat sheet or something, just ask for that, and I'll be happy to share that too. It's fictional, but I based it on like real life experience and examples from teams I know. So it's pretty. It covers everything I think it needs to.
Okay, great. We'll try and send that out with the post webinar materials. Another question here. So because of how important facial expressions are to communication in meetings and such, can you suggest ways to encourage remote workers to keep their cameras on? I'd love to not feel like we have to get work dressy just for a half-hour Zoom meeting. I think a lot of people probably feel that, I think a lot of us feel that way, that kind of pressure. It's camera off or it's dress up. Is there a way to kind of diffuse that and to make people feel a bit more comfortable?
That's a really good question. So in my experience, there's like broadly, very, very broadly speaking and generalizing a lot there, but two camps of people who are very comfortable with that and it's totally okay, and people who are actually surprisingly uncomfortable with that. And I've seen in a couple of meetings kind of people from the first group saying to the others like, hey, cameras on, please, I want to see your faces. And it wasn't received super well. So then kind of people for whom it was, it made them feel anxious. It made them feel like they would rather stay kind of hidden, so people couldn't see their facial expressions. And I got the feeling that, okay, forcing it isn't the way to go. It rarely is. I think maybe, what would be like a good, maybe if there's an incentive that could be offered there, that could help.
I'm just wondering if there's a I don't know, potential for like the Zoom equivalent of a dress down Fridays. I know a lot of people have like a social kind of Zoom chat on a Friday or have been through the pandemic, but maybe it's something leaders could take lead on in terms of, showing up in a Hawaiian shirt or something like that, just to add a little bit of humor and to kind of, just kind of deformalize the situation and the dynamic generally.
That makes sense. And Hawaiian shirt Friday, great Office Space reference. We were talking about it with Paul earlier. So I think that could help. I get the sense that for some people it's not just about the clothes, but now that I think about it, I would also maybe think about what kind of meeting it is. Like if it's, an all company, all hands, there's 50 people there, then, is it really necessary for people to have their cameras on? Because you're not going to see the individual faces really properly anyway. If it's a team meeting, then, I mean, if someone in a situation where they say like, hey, I, just got back from a run, I prefer to keep I'm keeping my camera off for now. I think that's fine. If somebody consistently keeps their camera off, and you find as the lead that, okay, that's a, maybe doesn't facilitate the kind of connection we're looking for here and the kind of immediacy, maybe I would bring it up in a one-on-one and say like, hey, I notice you're keeping your camera off quite a bit. Can I ask you why that is? And is there something we could do to help you be more comfortable with having your camera on? Context. I'm concerned that we're already working at a distance. We have so little face-to-face time anyway. I would like to have, at least this meeting where we're kind of face-to-face, even if it's via video. Yeah, that's probably how I would approach it. But I'm very, that's a great question, by the way. I'm very sure that if you search around, you will probably find other companies and teams who may be experiencing this problem, because I've heard it from quite a few sources. So yeah, so don't take my solution as the only one. There may be others out there, is what I'm saying.
I think that that question raises a really interesting point. I think the hardest part of this kind of change that we're talking about, changing a communication style, is bringing it up. I think is actually broaching the subject sometimes. So I was just wondering, do you have any advice if you are a manager and you are not very comfortable using emojis, or you're a little bit apprehensive about using them, or maybe feel it's not your communication style, but having listened to what you have to say, you really want these effects. How can you get started? What would be the kind of beginner level emoji use?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say, the smileys, like people said here when I asked about favorite emojis, there's one that kind of has rosy cheeks smiley. I think that's a good safe one. And the thing is, when you start using emojis, you will start getting them in return. So you quite quickly will start to kind of pick up on, okay, how are they used? What context is right? When it's a bit hard to give like general guidelines, because what's really fascinating about emojis is that every company, every team has their own kind of subculture. So people who left Blinkist, went to work somewhere else, I talked to them later, they were saying like, yeah, wow, they have used emojis completely differently here. Like we used the rocket emoji all the time, like when someone did something great, like, yeah, rocket, but they didn't have that at all. Similarly, in our content team, somehow we developed this culture where the seat emoji, it looks a bit like an airplane seat. That means like, heart to the power of 10, like, hey, hang in there. That sounds tough. You can do it. So it's a bit hard to give sort of general guidelines, because really every company, every team will have their own, and it's constantly changing. So I think the only thing you can do is kind of hop in and go with the flow, and learn as you go. Yeah, that's how I would approach that. And yeah, maybe stick to the safer ones like the smileys and whatnot in the beginning. But as I say, you will quickly learn how they work, and it's very intuitive.
What about the other side of that power dynamic? What if you are an employee, team member, and you're very comfortable using emojis, but your manager, your leader, does not really do that, and maybe again you're a bit apprehensive about just jumping in with an emoji and maybe perhaps looking a little bit possibly it's deemed unprofessional, or like you don't want to cause a bad impression. How is that? Should it be addressed in a conversation? Should it be hey, I'd like to start using emojis. I think it would enhance our communications. Maybe share an article like the one you wrote for the Attuned blog. Would that be a good starting point, or are there any other ways that people can introduce this to their managers?
That's a great question. So yeah, that's a challenging situation. Like in general, the guideline is kind of to customize your communication to the person you're communicating to. So if you know that, yeah, they think emojis are nonsense, maybe don't employ them at first, but rather go the route you suggested. Maybe share somewhere publicly, like, hey, I just saw this article, the Guardian one or the one I wrote or something else, and say like, hey, this is great. I love emojis. I feel like I find emojis a useful tool exactly in these remote times. And then maybe in the one-on-one, exactly as you say, bring it up and say like, hey, I read this article. I want to start employing this tool more. Are you comfortable with me using it in our communications? I notice you don't use it that much, which is fine, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that I would like to start using this. And hey, maybe you can give me feedback as to how you perceive that. So kind of definitely addressing it openly rather than just starting to use them, because there is that risk that maybe the other person is like me 5 years ago, and they will look at it a bit like, really? So yeah, that's probably a good way to go about it.
Okay, great. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. So if anyone has any burning questions they still would like to ask Ben, we've still got a bit of time for that. So please use the chat or the Q&A function to ask those. In the meantime, I kind of, I guess on a slightly more practical or possibly, yeah, kind of note that might be good to bear in mind. Is there any emojis that you should generally avoid, or any either specific emojis or kind of like genres of emojis that could be, easily misconstrued or perhaps culturally insensitive if people are working on cross geographies and cross-cultural teams, or maybe just have a double meaning that people may or may not be aware of that could land you in a bit of hot water if it was misconstrued?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's challenging again because it's so splintered and constantly changing. I think in the blog post I referenced this aubergine emoji. So yeah, stay away from that. I'd say maybe depending on your relationship with the person, like if you want to heart something, maybe use a blue heart or something else. It's like I'd say broadly the heart has become detached from the idea of romantic love, but maybe better safe than sorry. Obviously the kiss emoji would be very, very risky. But I really hope that people cut each other some slack, because there are all these different cultures in teams. And, if someone uses an emoji that maybe has a subtext or hidden meaning for some generation or for some like say subgroup or younger culture, for example, then I would like to think that also they will know. Like, for example, recently I read that the simple smile, just the very basic emoji, that's by sort of younger workers just entering the workforce, that they may consider that as passive aggressive. But I would like to think that even when they see it coming from, someone who doesn't use a ton of emojis, they would understand that, okay, probably this doesn't really mean that they hate me. This is them using emojis. So I think you can hope that people give you the benefit of the doubt, and they will.
Yeah, I think that's a general rule. Probably, if it's even a question, then maybe it's not the right emoji to use, and just err on the side of caution. Yes. At all times. Another question come in here about how many emojis do you recommend adding to emails? Can you use too many emojis in an email or a message, or is there a kind of rule of thumb? Is 1, 2, 3? Is there a limit?
Good question. And let me just say, by the way, that just I couldn't really comment on this great input coming into the chat before. I did sort of see it just to the side, and so many great comments and ideas. So thank you everyone for those. And regarding this question, so I think that the emojis should always serve the purpose of your communication. Like, probably if you write a paragraph in writing, you're not trying to communicate 7 different points there. You're probably going for 1 or 2 or 3. And similarly, you probably don't want to add 7 emojis to it, but you might want to add like 1 or maybe 2. Also, can be enough to just add 1 maybe at the beginning of the message, kind of establish the tone, and another one at the end to kind of reinforce that. So that's also enough. Maybe start small. And again, watch how people react, what kind of messages you start to get in response, because then, people might be like my team when I started using emojis. Okay, this guy gets it. And then they started to sort of use more emojis with me too. And then I picked up like, okay, this is how you use them. That's the nuance there. This is the appropriate amount. That was too much. So start small, maybe 1 for a short message, a couple for a longer message. Or if you have like drastically different sort of emotional tones in each paragraph, then add 1 for each para. And the great thing about emojis also is, or one kind of use case is that, you can pretty easily make long walls of text more readable. So you send an update about a project to Slack, instead of having like, metrics, goals for next week, challenges, and it's just one long block of text. You put like a chart emoji in front of metrics. You put, the target with the dart in the middle for goals. You put, the sweat smile or something for challenges, and it makes it much more pleasant to read. Also, it just somehow, makes it like you put a bit of design work into it, but it's so quick, so easy.
I think that's a great point. Actually, it's not just the clarification of the message. It does feel like you've spent a bit more time crafting something and being thoughtful and making something that's not just brain dump onto a page. So I think that's a really great point. I was just going to say, we have a couple of people asking about how to contact you. Would you mind skipping back to the slide with your contact detail on it?
Absolutely, if I can make that work. Hang on. Oops, here we go. So ben@hybridhabits.com works well. I'm also on LinkedIn. There's probably a ton of Ben Hughes out there, but if you search for Ben Hughes Blinkist, you'll find me.
Okay, fantastic. I think we're going to have to wrap up there. Much as I would like to continue this discussion, super fascinating. Might be a good way to end if everyone wants to add an emoji, either their favorite emoji or the emoji that sums up how they're feeling right now in the chat. That would be nice to see. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Ben. That was super interesting. I really enjoyed it. I think everyone else did, looking at the emojis coming in. It seems like we've got some very happy faces there, literally. So thank you so much. If anyone missed part of this or would like to share this webinar with anyone, we will be sending out a kind of link to watch it on demand in the next few days. We'll also send out the slides so you can look through and maybe one or two of the other things that Ben mentioned. So look out for that email coming soon. We'll also give you the chance to sign up early for our next webinar, which is taking place on the 29th of June. And the title for that one is How Can Organizations Make Work More Meaningful? So thank you very, very much to everyone for joining us today. Ben, any last words?
But thank you for inviting me, and thanks everyone for joining and all your great input in the comments. And yeah, good luck out there.